Hi, I'm Emily Taylor from Solve M.E, and this is Advocacy in Action, where we highlight the impacts of your advocacy. Today, we're looking at congressional hearings and how your advocacy resulted in questions live on Capitol Hill.
Many Americans who've had COVID will have continuing symptoms. I have these weird neurological symptoms a year later. They're not debilitating, they're not painful, but they're weird and they're 24/7. Many people have symptoms that are more serious: heart impairment, respiratory impairment, impairment of mental functioning, fatigue challenges. How should we as a committee, how should we as a nation, how should the institutions you work for be thinking, planning, investing in these two long-term sets of consequences: mental health and the physical needs of the COVID long symptoms?
Let me address the one that you mentioned about the persistent of post-COVID sequelae, which is a really serious and real issue. It's not imaginary. It varies from person to person. The NIH, with the generosity of the Congress, has invested $1.15 billion in collaboration with the CDC and other agencies in looking at the scope of this real phenomenon, this sequelae, what the ultimate pathogenesis is, because we don't know what the mechanisms are. You mentioned a weird neurological symptom. We're not really quite sure what that is. And we're putting together large cohort studies to be able to find out what the incidence of it is, what the variability, what the range of organ system dysfunctions are, and what the underlying pathogenic mechanisms is. Really very puzzling, Senator, because it's different than if someone is in ICU and has lung damage and you have a pulmonary function abnormality, so you have a cardiomyopathy and you have a stroke volume that's down. It's different than that. It's people who recover, have the virus no longer there, and have a persistence of things like chronic fatigue, muscle aches, temperature dysregulation, funny kind of neurological issues that they can't explain. That's what we're really focusing on in cohorts of tens of thousands of people. So we are looking at that seriously.
I'd like to build on that then, because we hear about the long haulers or the long-term effects of COVID-19. We see people really suffering from this. We know about 30% of all COVID patients really continue to suffer from some form of ill-defined symptoms: prolonged fatigue, brain fog, as some people are calling that. It may render folks unable to go to work. It puts them at risk for continued social isolation and other kinds of issues. It may certainly decrease their immune system. And so we have to be sure that we don't deny benefits to these folks who have the long haul symptom. But what can you tell me about, Dr. Fauci, about NIH, how you're evaluating these troubling long-term health consequences? And are there treatments available? What's in the pipeline there for those that are continuing to suffer?
Right.
Some people sense a smell. I've heard rancid smell. Now they get their smell back, but everything smells sour or rotten. What are you doing?
We've initiated a major program to the tune of $1.15 billion that we're doing at the NIH, also in collaboration with the CDC, and following cohorts of individuals to determine the incidence, the prevalence, how long these symptoms last. We have some studies say they go out up to 8 months or longer. You asked a very relevant question. What about treatment of them? It is very difficult to devise a therapeutic regimen when you don't know what the underlying pathogenic mechanism of the disease is. And that's the real stumbling block here, and why we are intensively studying these individuals, because although it is an absolutely real phenomenon, we don't have any pathogenic mechanisms right now that we're certain of that has a commonality among all of them. We will find that out, and when we do, then we'll be able to devise hopefully appropriate and effective therapies.
So I'm going to turn the attention to the issue of long COVID. some call it long hauler COVID. And for months, we've heard reports about people, Americans across this country, suffering from COVID-19 for many, many months. My own niece, formerly a world-class ski racer, she was on the United States ski team. I'm so proud of her. She became sick with COVID last April and continues to this day, almost a year later, to have trouble with the simplest of daily activities. She has to choose between taking a shower or cooking dinner. She doesn't have the energy to do both. She's 34 years old and previously extraordinarily not only healthy, but an amazing athlete. Laurel has seen so many doctors over the last many months, adding up to thousands of dollars of out-of-pocket expenses. She's gone through endless testing, and none of which has been helpful in identifying exactly what she's suffering from. And she is not alone. According to the National Institutes of Health, more than 50% of COVID-19 patients experience lingering symptoms longer than 90 days after recovering from the initial infection. Dr. Fauci, I was so pleased to see NIH's announcement last month that it had launched a nationwide initiative to identify the causes and ways to prevent and treat long COVID. What do we know so far about what causes or prevents long COVID, how we can treat it, and how long these symptoms might last?
Thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman Custer. This is a very important issue that we take very seriously. The first thing we can say, this is real. This is not imaginary. These are people whose symptoms are real. And as you mentioned, it's really variable. Different studies say anywhere from 25 to over the 35, 40% of individuals have prolongation of symptoms that measure not only in weeks, but in months, some of which, as your subject that you described, become completely incapacitating. What we need to know first, and that was the study that we announced just a short while ago, we need to know the extent of this, the percentage and the duration of it. Underlying this seems to be a commonality of symptoms, just as you mentioned very correctly. Profound fatigue, muscle aches, temperature dysregulation, unexplainable tachycardia, and what people refer to as brain fog, which is just a strange feeling of being unable to focus or concentrate for any period of time. The NIH has been now given an appropriation of $1.15 billion to study this disease, and you will be hearing more announcements, not only to understand the scope of the cohort, but the underlying cause and what the mechanisms are. We call that pathogenesis. Once we understand that, then we can start talking about designing therapies. But it is a very disconcerting syndrome that I believe is going to have effects that will go on well beyond the control epidemiologically of this syndrome. Thank you.
Dr. Walensky, is the CDC also working on this long COVID, and how will you coordinate with NIH in that effort?
We are. Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. We are actively doing evaluations. We're doing studies. We're collecting cohort data, and we will report those data as they emerge.
Well, we will anxiously await it. Thank you for all that you're doing. We're very grateful. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
If you want your advocacy to make a difference, join the Long COVID Alliance and Solve M.E. this April for Advocacy Week. Learn more and register for meetings with your member of Congress at the links below.